The Self and Consciousness, John Locke, Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Although we undergo many changes in life, it seems necessary for us to have a sense of selfhood, of personal identity, if we are to understand our lives and make sense of ourselves as beings who somehow endure, despite all the changes. But what are the criteria or conditions for personal identity? For saying, for example, that the individual I see across the street in London is the same person I met in Los Angeles last year. One of the most important philosophical writers on personal identity was the 17th century English philosopher John Locke. In the extract that follows, Locke identifies the self with a conscious thinking thing, although he sometimes uses the language of dualism, the conception of an immaterial mind, or soul, as a substance in its own right. He makes it clear that it does not really matter what kind of substance the self is, whether spiritual or material, simple or compounded. It matters not. The important thing is the consciousness we have of ourselves as enduring subjects, consciousness that depends on the memories that link who we are now or with who we were in the past. Notice that Locke's memory criterion yields a test for personal identity that does not have to coincide with the conditions for physical or bodily identity. In Locke's famous example of an imaginary body swap, if a prince took over the body of a cobbler, then provided he still had all the conscious memories of the prince, when he woke up in the cobbler's body, we would have to say that he was still the same person, though because of the change of body, we could not say he was the same man, the same physical human being. Locke's account of personal identity thus rejects external, physiological or biological tests in favour of that inner awareness each individual has of itself as a conscious being, enduring through time as a centre of self-concern. In Locke's words, concern for itself, as far as that consciousness extends. To find wherein personal identity consists, we must consider what person stands for, which I think is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection, can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing, in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness which is inseparable from thinking, and, as it seems to me, essential for it, it being possible for anyone to perceive without perceiving that he does not perceive. When we see, hear, smell, taste, feel, mediate, or will anything, we know that we do so. Thus it is always as to our present sensations and perceptions, and by this everyone is to himself that which he calls self, it not being considered in this case whether the same self be continued in the same or different substances. For since consciousness always accompanies thinking, and it is that which makes everyone to be what he calls self, and thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking things, in this alone consists personal identity, i.e. the sameness of a rational being, and as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. It is the same self, now it was then, and it is by the same self, as this present one that now reflects on it, that that action was done. But it is further inquired whether it be the same identical substance. This few would think they had reason to doubt of, if these perceptions, with their consciousness, always remained present in the mind, whereby the same thinking thing would be always consciously present, and, evidently, the same to itself. But that which seems to make the difficulty is this, that the consciousness is interrupted always by forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives wherein we have the whole train of our own past actions before our eyes in one view. But even the best memories lose the sight of one part while they are viewing another, and that the greatest part of our lives do not reflect on our own past selves, being intent on our present thoughts, and in sound sleep we have no thoughts at all, or at least none with that consciousness which remarks our waking thoughts. I say in all these cases our consciousness is being interrupted, and we losing the sight of our past selves, doubts are raised whether we are the same thinking thing, i.e. the same substance or no, which, however reasonable or unreasonable, concerns not personal identity at all. The question being that makes the same person, and not whether it be the same identical substance, which always thinks in the same person, which, in this case, matters not at all. For, it being the same consciousness that makes a man be himself to himself, personal identity depends on that only, irrespective of whether it be annexed solely to one individual substance, or can be continued in a succession of several substances. For as far as any intelligent being can repeat the idea of any past action with the same consciousness it had of at first, and with the same consciousness it has of any present action, so far it is the same personal self, for it is by the consciousness it has of its present thoughts and actions that it is self to itself now, and so will be the same self as far as the same consciousness can extend to actions past or to come, and it would be by a distance of time or change of substance no more two persons than a man be two men by wearing other clothes today than he did yesterday, with a long or short sleep between. The same consciousness unites those distant actions into the same person, whether substances contributed to their production. That this is so, we have some kind of evidence in our very bodies, all whose particles, whilst vitally united to this same thinking conscious self, so that we feel when they are touched and are affected by and conscious of good or harm that happens to them, are a part of ourselves, that is, of our thinking conscious self. Thus the limbs of the body are to everyone a part of himself. He sympathizes and is concerned for them. Cut off a hand, and thereby separated from the consciousness he had of its heat, cold, and other affections, and it is then no longer a part of that which is himself, any more than the remotest part of matter. Thus, we see the substance whereof personal self consisted at one time may be varied at another, without the change of personal identity, there being no question about the same person, though the limbs, which but now were part of it, be cut off. But the question is whether, if the same substance, which thinks, be changed, it can be the same person, or remaining the same, it can be different persons. And to this I answer first, this can be no question at all to those who place thought in a purely material, animal constitution, void of an immaterial substance. For, whether their supposition be true or no, it is plain they conceive personal identity preserved in something else than identity of substance, as animal identity is preserved in identity of life and not of substance, and therefore those who place thinking in an immaterial substance only, before they can come to deal with these men, must show why personal identity cannot be preserved in the change of immaterial substances, or variety of particular immaterial substances, as well as animal identity is preserved in the change of material substances, or variety of particular bodies. Unless they will say it is one immaterial spirit that makes the same life in brutes, as it is one immaterial spirit that makes the same person in men, which the Cartesians at least will not admit, for fear of making brutes thinking things too. But next, as to the first part of the question, whether, if the same thinking substance, supposing immaterial substances only to think, be changed, it can be the same person, I answer this. It can only be resolved by those who know what kind of substances they are that think, and whether the consciousness of past actions can be transferred from one thinking substance to another. It must be allowed if the same consciousness, which, as has been shown, is quite a different thing from the same numerical figure or motion in body, can be transferred from one thinking substance to another, it will be possible that two thinking substances may make but one person, for the same consciousness being preserved, whether in the same or different substances, the personal identity is preserved. As to the second part of the question, whether, the same immaterial substance remaining, there may be two distinct persons. The question seems to me to be built on this: whether the same immaterial being conscious of the actions of its past duration, may be wholly stripped of all the consciousness of its past existence, and lose it beyond the power of ever retrieving again, and so, as it were beginning a new account from a new period, have a consciousness that cannot reach beyond the new state. Let anyone reflect upon himself and conclude that he has in himself an immaterial spirit, which is that which thinks in him, and in the constant change of his body keeps him the same, and is that which he calls himself. Let him also suppose it is to be the same soul that was in Nestor or Thersites at the siege of Troy, for souls being, as far as we know anything of them, in their nature indifferent to any parcel of matter, the supposition has no apparent absurdity in it. But if he now has no consciousness of any of the actions either of Nestor or Thersites, does or can he conceive himself the same person with either of them? Can he be concerned in either of their actions, attribute them to himself, or think them his own, more than the actions of any other men that ever existed? So that, this consciousness not reaching to any of the actions of either of those men, he is no more one self than either of them, than if the soul, or immaterial spirit, that now informs him, had been created and began to exist when it began to inform his present body, though it were ever so true that the same spirit that informed Nestor's or Thersites' body were numerically the same that now informs his. For this would no more make him the same person as Nestor, than if some of the particles of matter that were once a part of Nestor were now part of this man. The same immaterial substance without the same consciousness no more makes the same person by being united to any body than the same particle of matter without consciousness united to any body makes the same person. But let him once find himself conscious of any of the actions of Nestor, he then finds himself the same person as Nestor. And thus we may be able, without any difficulty, to conceive the same person at the resurrection, though in a body not exactly in make or parts the same which he had here, the same consciousness going along with the soul that inhabits it. But yet the soul alone, in the change of bodies, would scarcely to anyone be enough to make the same man, for should the soul of a prince, carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life, enter and inform the body of a cobbler, as soon as deserted by his own soul, everyone sees he would be the same person as the prince, accountable only for the prince's actions. But who would say it was the same man? The body too goes to the making the man, and would, I guess, to everybody, determine the man in this case, for the soul, with all its princely thoughts about it, would not make another man, but he would be the same cobbler to everybody besides him. I know that in the ordinary way of speaking, the same person and the same man stand for one and the same thing, and indeed, everyone will always have a liberty to speak as he pleases, and to apply what articulate sounds to what ideas he thinks fit, and change them as often as he pleases. But yet, when we will inquire what makes the same spirit, man or person, we must fix the ideas of spirit, man or person in our minds, and having resolved with ourselves what we mean by them, it will not be hard to determine when it is the same and when not. But though the same immaterial substance or soul does not alone, whether it be, and in whatsoever state, make the same man, yet it is plain, consciousness, as far as ever it can be extended, even to ages past, unites existences and actions very remote in time into the same person, as well as it does the existences and actions of the immediately preceding moment. So whatever has the consciousness of present and past actions in the same person to whom they both belong. Had I the same consciousness that I saw the Ark and Noah's flood, as that I saw an overflowing of the Thames last winter, or as that I write now, I could no more doubt that I that write this now, that saw the Thames overflowed last winter, and that viewed the flood of the general deluge, was the same self. place that self in what substance you please, than that I write that this am I the same myself now, whilst I write, whether I consist of all the same substance, material or immaterial, or no, that I was yesterday. For as to this point of being the same self, it matters not whether this present self be made up of the same or other substances, I being as much concerned, and as justly accountable for any action that was done 1,000 years since, appropriated to me now by this self-consciousness, as I am for what I did the last moment. Self is that conscious thinking thing, whether substance made up of, whether spiritual or material, simple or compounded, it matters not, which is sensible or conscious of pleasure and pain, capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself, as far as that consciousness extends. Thus everybody finds that, whilst comprehended under that consciousness, the little finger is as much part of itself as what is most so. Upon the separation of this little finger, should this consciousness go along with the little finger and leave the rest of the body, it is evident that the little finger would be the person, the same person, and self, then would have nothing to do with the rest of the body, and in this case it is the consciousness that goes along with the substance, when one part is separate from another, which makes the same person, and constitutes this inseparable self. So it is in reference to substance remote in time, that with which the consciousness of this present thinking thing can join itself, makes the same person, and is one self with it, and with nothing else, and so attributes to itself, and owns all the actions of that thing as its own, as part of that consciousness reaches, and no further, as everyone who reflects will perceive. In this personal identity is founded all the right and justice of reward and punishment, happiness and misery being that for which everyone is concerned for himself, and not mattering what becomes of any substance not joined to or affected with that consciousness. For, as it is evident in the instance I gave but now, if the consciousness went along with the little finger when it was cut off, that would be the same self which was concerned for the whole body yesterday, as making part of itself, whose actions then it cannot but admit as its own now. Though if the same body should still live, and immediately from the separation of the little finger have its own peculiar consciousness, whereof the little finger knew nothing, it would not at all be concerned for it as a part of itself, nor could it own any of its actions, or have any of them imputed to him. This may show us wherein personal identity consists not in the identity of substance, but, as I have said, in the identity of consciousness, wherein if Socrates and the present Mayor of Queensborough agree, they are the same person. If the same Socrates walking and sleeping do not partake of the same consciousness, Socrates walking and sleeping is not the same person. And to punish Socrates waking for what sleeping Socrates thought, and waking Socrates was never conscious of, would be no more right than to punish one twin what his brother twin did, whereof he knew nothing, because their outsides were so like that they could not be distinguished, for such twins have been seen. But yet possibly it will still be objected, suppose I wholly lose the memory of some parts of my life beyond a possibility of retrieving them, so that perhaps I shall never be conscious of them again. Yet am I not the same person that did these actions, had those thoughts that I once was conscious of, though I have now forgot them? To which I answer that we must here take notice what the word I is applied to, which in this case is the man only, and the same man being presumed to be the same person, I is easily here supposed to stand, also for the same person. But if it be possible for the same man to have distinct, incommunicable consciousness at different times, it is past doubt the same man would at different times make different persons, which, we see, is the sense of mankind in the solemnest declaration of their opinions. Human laws not punishing the madman for the sober man's actions, nor the sober man for what the madman did, thereby making them two persons. This is somewhat explained by our way of speaking in English, when we say such a one is not himself, or is beside himself, in which phrase it is insinuated as if those who now, or at least first used them, thought that self was changed. The self-same person was no longer in that man. But is not a man drunk and sober the same person? Why else is he punished for the fact he commits when drunk, though he be never afterwards conscious of it? Just as much the same person as a man that walks and does other things in his sleep is the same person, and is answerable for any mischief he shall do in it. Human laws punish both, with a justice suitable to their way of knowledge, because, in these cases, they cannot distinguish certainly what is real, what counterfeit, and so the ignorance in drunkenness or sleep is not admitted as a plea. For, though punishment be annexed to personality, and personality to consciousness, and the drunkard perhaps be not conscious of what he did, yet human judicatures justly punish him, because the fact is proved against him, but lack of consciousness cannot be proved for him. But in the great day, wherein the secrets of all hearts shall be laid open, it may be reasonable to think that no one shall be made to answer what he knows nothing of, but shall receive his final judgment, his conscience accusing or excusing him. Could we suppose two distinct incommunicable consciousnesses acting the same body, the one constantly by day, the other by night, and, on the other side, the same consciousness acting by intervals, two distinct bodies? I ask in the first case, whether the day and the night man would not be two as distinct persons as Socrates and Plato, and whether in the second case there would not be one person in two distinct bodies, as much as one man is the same in two distinct clothings. Nor is it at all material to say that this same and this distinct consciousness in the cases above mentioned is owing to the same and distinct immaterial substances, bringing it with them to those bodies. This, whether true or no, alters not the case, since it is evident that the personal identity would be equally determined by the consciousness, whether that consciousness were annexed to some individual immaterial substance or no. For, granting that the thinking substance in man must be necessarily supposed immaterial, it is evident that immaterial thinking may sometimes part with its past consciousness, and be restored to it again, as appears in the forgetfulness men often have of their past actions, and the mind many times recovers the memory of a past consciousness which it had lost for 20 years together. Make these intervals of memory and forgetfulness to take their turns regularly by day and night, and you have two persons with the same immaterial spirit, as much as in the former instance two persons with the same body, so that self is not determined by identity or diversity of substance, which it cannot be sure of, but only by identity of consciousness.